memorable day as a teacher, surely, was in the company of a group of 15-year-old lads and girls in a secondary school in Maghull, just north of Liverpool. There was only a small number of them because these were the untouchables, the incorrigibles. The ones where at the beginning of every year people would peer frantically at the timetable to see if they had this particular class, and horror of horrors if they had it last period in the afternoon. They were a mixture of sullen, dumb and just plain nasty. But there was one bright spark among them, Michael. He took the seat at the very back of the class. I can see him now, lounging back, leaning against the wall, feet sort of spread-eagled across the corridor, fingers drumming on the desk, and his bright eyes eagerly looking at everything going on in the classroom, just waiting for the opportunity to make a wisecrack or to undermine me, the teacher, in some way or another. He was smart, he just used it all the wrong way. I suppose a bit like what I was like at school, really. Well, it was my job to teach them GCSE religious education. And we tried everything. We did the pop music, we did the videos, we did the textbooks, the questions, the discussions. To be honest, the only thing that really worked effectively all the time was pulling them in, writing stuff on the board and saying, copy that down into your books. They were happy as anything. We got up to the story of the prodigal son, and while I was planning it, I was reviewing in my mind, what's the best approach for this? Should we do the old modernising the parable? You know, the way you do the Good Samaritan with, there was a Manchester United supporter who was lying bleeding on the floor, and another Manchester supporter passed by, and then a Liverpool supporter came and he helped him. No, I think even I was past that by that stage. There's some good videos, there's some slide sequences, there's all sorts of ways of modernising it, of course, but I thought, do you know what, I'll just tell the story, just like Jesus would have done. No Ferraris, no discos, no drinking excessive amounts of Johnny Walker, Red Bull. Just the story, the way Jesus would have told it. So I sat them all down and I said, I want to tell you a story. This is a story that Jesus told. There was a man who had 2 sons. And that was it. We were into the story. I explained the cultural bits that they wouldn't have understood at the time about working with pigs and things like that. But essentially, I just narrated the story. They were engrossed. There was absolute silence. Every eye was fixated on me. Every ear was attentive to what was going on. It absolutely captivated them. Even Michael. Not a peep out of him. Until right near the end. I was just describing how the father had put the fine robes on his son, and he'd put a ring on his finger, and they'd slaughtered an animal, and they'd prepared a feast, and everybody was happy. And Michael just blurted out from the back of the room, so what was the older brother doing while all this was going on? Funny you should ask, I said to him. The power of a story. Tim Shepherd is a communications consultant from Bristol, working with corporations mainly. But he's devoted part of his website to a fascinating review of storytelling traditions from all around the world. And his main focus in his corporate work is on how storytelling can really get your message across. Let me just read you something he says. The power of story and narrative is crucial in communication skills and can turn dry facts or abstract principles into compelling material which is absorbed and remembered by its audience. The principles of narrative tie everything together and give it meaning. Jesus was a great storyteller. People flocked around him. I love the authorized version translation where it says the common people heard him gladly. Children flocked around him as well, of course. The stories he told were stories which would have been familiar to all of those who were listening. And you can almost see them nodding and mentally ticking off the people they knew who fitted the bill. Of course, the sower, he may have pointed to a sower as he was talking about that particular story. But the person who was so lucky as to find a treasure in the field, I suppose today we talk about the neighbour who won the lottery. There would be the steward of the house who was stealing from his master, and everyone knew it except the master. Of course, there was the Pharisee who would stand up at the back of the synagogue and talk about what a wonderful person he was. I can just see everyone sitting around going, oh yes, I know him. Oh, he must be thinking of so-and-so. They were stories that really related to people. They knew what he was talking about. Of course, Jesus was tapping into a very long tradition of storytelling in the Middle East generally, but as we look at it in the Bible, it's very clear that so many of the great stories of the Bible were long oral traditions developed before they were ever written down. And my favourite example of this, of course, is the story of Esther, which even today at the Feast of Purim that is celebrated by the Jews. They tell the story and all the kids are encouraged to boo when Haman's name's mentioned and cheer when Mordecai's mentioned. Poor old Haman gets vilified. I read somewhere that they write his name on the bottom of their shoes and stamp on the floor to really grind him into the dust. A fantastic story that just lays hold of people and teaches them something about who they are. And we get specific mentions of this in the Bible. In Exodus and in Joshua, on 2 different occasions, the people are told, when your children come and ask you, why do we do this? Then tell them the story. In Arabic-speaking countries, that tradition has really carried on as well. I was fascinated to find out that Arabic storytellers known as Hakawati have been working pretty much non-stop in places like Damascus, in coffee houses, right through for the last 700 years, and are still telling the story of the Crusades. Sadly, with the present war that's going on, there's the civil unrest, there's a severe danger that this great tradition might start coming to an end. But it's fascinating that people will still turn up and drink coffee and listen to somebody telling stories from 700 years ago. There's a lot more about traditions of storytelling in the kind of the essay and the notes that go with this video. There's so much it would make a BBC Two special rather than just a short video. But we should say that the tradition of storytelling is really making a comeback in the Western world. There's a wonderful programme on US radio, it's a podcast really, called The Moth Radio Hour. And the moth, because it's this idea of somebody in the lights, standing up on a stage in front of an invited audience, just telling their story, telling about something that's happened to them. I've listened to a few of these and they are completely gripping. And in fact they were used for quite a sophisticated experiment on the functioning of the brain by a guy called Jack Gallant, who's from University of California at Berkeley. He used an MRI scanner. Volunteers were put in there for 2 hours and they were just given headphones and they were given podcasts from the Moth Radio Hour to listen to, things that they could focus on and get engaged in. and the results were spectacular. Synapses were flashing all over the place. The whole brain seemed to get involved in responding to and processing what was going on in these stories. Quite obviously, storytelling is something which lights people up. Now, there's a strong connection between storytelling and story singing, or what I would call folk ballads, the folk ballad tradition in the Western world. Again, Tim Shepard's picked this up, talking about storytelling around the world. It's a direct quote again, so forgive me for reading it. One thing to bear in mind is that in many old traditions, storytelling is synonymous with song, chant, music or epic poetry. Especially in the bardic traditions, stories may be chanted or sung along with musical accompaniment on a certain instrument. Therefore, some who would be called folk musicians by foreign music enthusiasts are just as accurately called storytellers. Their roles, in fact, are often as much spiritual teachers and exemplars or healers, for which the stories and music are vehicles, as well as historians and tradition bearers. Now, doesn't that really sound like something that belongs in our churches? The storytelling in the Western world, particularly the English British tradition, is what I'm particularly interested in at this point, and it is very strong. To connect with the Crusaders again, the story is that Richard Coeur de Lion, on the way back from the Crusades, was actually identified and eventually rescued by the troubadour Blondel. And those sort of bardic or troubadour traditions have certainly been well embedded in the English speaking world for many, many centuries. British folk songs traced back to the 16th, 17th century are fascinating. They contain lots and lots of social comments, lots and lots of up-to-date singing of the news. They're often known as broadsheet ballads because that's how they were published. People printed the words on broadsheets. They didn't need to print the music, and of course they couldn't create recordings of the music because they were tending to use tunes which are already very well known, tunes which belong to the folk tradition. The United States national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, started off as a broadsheet ballad. The guy who wrote it was a prisoner on a British ship watching the bombardment of one of the forts on the coast during the American Revolutionary War, and there was the flag flying above it, so he was driven to write these verses, which were quickly printed and circulated round. It was the 1920s before it was officially adopted as the US national anthem, but it just gained acceptance and credibility and usefulness in the lives of people from that day forward. It just became something that they wanted to sing and that they associated with their feelings of patriotism. So folk songs can have a very strong influence on the way people think. They were used, of course, in the early days to some extent as ways of protesting against the kind of things that were going on in society. In fairness, lots of folk songs, most folk songs, kind of just tell stories about what is, but some of them were deliberately used to try and promote social change. There was a movement of people called the Levellers or the Diggers in the 17th century, and they produced a series of broadsheet ballads. The words of one of them include the immortal lines, "The gentry must come down and the poor shall wear the crown. Stand up, diggers all." I suppose Methodism, with its connections in the 19th century with some of the early trades unions and socialist movements and things like that, would have a bit more empathy with those sorts of words. So there are dozens of great folk songs which celebrate the courage of the ordinary working man, and it's not surprising that this musical and lyrical form is what was developed particularly in the US, particularly during the 40s and 50s by people like Woody Guthrie, into what became the protest song movement of the 60s, which really grew and flourished with the likes of course, Dylan and Paul Simon, Pete Seeger, Phil Oakes, Joan Baez, a whole range of people who basically stood up and sang out and gave words and gave music and gave force to the things that people were thinking about. Anti-Vietnam War, the poverty and all that kind of thing. The roots of that, of course, it should be said, that partly from that kind of English folk song tradition which crossed the Atlantic and became kind of Appalachian folk music, but also equally in that case from some of the African traditions which were brought across the Atlantic again by the slave communities and grew into the blues in the early 20th century. So people like Dylan, their material in the early days was equally split between some of the traditional folk music styles and some of the blues music styles. Now, of course, there was a distinctly kind of Christian protest movement and adoption of folk music in the 60s. I have a liking for Sydney Carter, and years ago we used to sing some of his songs in one of the bands I belonged to. He's only known now really for Lord of the Dance. I nearly said Lord of the Rings, but it's actually Lord of the Dance. And that's really quite a strange song for him to be associated with and to find its way into our hymn book. When we were in India, there was a German medical missionary there, and the subject of the Lord of the Dance came up somehow, and she was apoplectic. How dare Christians sing that song? Lord of the Dance, of course, is one of the titles of Lord Shiva in Hinduism, and I can't think that there's anywhere in the Bible where this concept of Lord of the Dance ever appears. In fact, writing in the Telegraph when he did an obituary of Sydney Carter, the author said that Sydney Carter recognised that he'd probably been influenced in writing this song by, believe it or not, having a statue of Shiva on his desk. And when he was asked to explain the oddity and the difficulty of that situation, he just smiled and said, well, I just never sought to explain it. It's perhaps a good example of how, if you're not careful, songs can actually dictate our theology instead of, in good old Wesleyan tradition, using theology to shape our songs and to shape the worship that we offer to God. But leaving that aside, Sydney Carter wrote some terrific songs, and they were to do with social justice. They were to do with abandoning sort of ritualistic Christianity and trying to get to the heart of things. He had a wonderful song called Bird of Heaven that just talked about the way the bird of heaven was trapped inside the gilded fittings of churches and this kind of thing. He had a very memorable one called Knocking at the Window, which pictures a nice Christian family sitting there trying to enjoy their Christmas dinner while refugees are trying to beat the door down. No use knocking on the window, some are lucky, some are not, sir. We are Christian men and women, and we're keeping what we've got, sir. More recently, the likes of John Bell and Graham Maul from the Iona community have really specialised in using folk tunes and folk idioms and words and imagery in their songs in a way which really makes them sound very fresh to our ears today. There's an example that I find interesting, which is a song that we often sing at Easter, Now the Green Blade Riseth. And I find it interesting really because for years I'd assumed that this was a traditional song, and in fact when I recorded it with some friends on a self-made album years ago, I just attributed it to traditional. But when I came to investigate it, it turns out it was only written in about 1900 by a minister from Cheshire. But it's got a wonderful old world feeling. It's got a folk song feeling to it. And what it inevitably puts me in mind of, in terms of its imagery, is a classic folk song called John Barleycorn. There were three men came from the west, their fortunes for to try. And it talks about how they take John Barleycorn and they throw him in the ground and they bury him and they say he's dead, but his head springs up and he says, I'm still here. So they cut him down and they beat him, and you can kind of see where this is going. It turns out that it's a parable about how ale is produced, and the punchline is that whatever they've done to him, John Barleycorn comes out the victor in the end, because no man can fight against strong ale. One really fascinating area, which I really only discovered while I was looking into this, although I'd come across it a little bit before, is a tradition called sacred harp singing, which is very strong in the southern states of the USA and has continued for 150 years without change, and is becoming very popular in other areas. You get sacred harp singing conventions in Dublin and in London and, you know, many other areas. It's quite fascinating. It's uses a kind of musical notation called shape singing, where as the notes are written on the stave, they all have different shapes, diamonds and squares and triangles, and they give clues to the way that the tune goes, the length of the notes, all those sorts of things. And it's called sacred harp singing because the book on which this is all based is called, oddly enough, Sacred Harp, and it was essentially a book of tunes, and tunes set to fairly common meters so that they could be melded together with hymn words by Charles Wesley, by Isaac Watts and various other writers, and used for this celebratory kind of singing. It's an amazing art form. I've got a snippet of it on a video in a moment or two, and you really just need to listen to it and immerse yourself into this sound. But it's a great illustration again of how traditional tunes, which many of these sacred harp tunes were, can find a new life when they're put into the service of wonderful words. Anyway, let's have a listen to it. great singing, and that's, to me, is a tremendous spiritual experience. It really taps into something deep within. But before leaving this subject or this part of it completely, it's worth mentioning one more hymn, which is, I suppose, the most obvious example. It's Who Would True Valour See, the John Bunyan poem from Pilgrim's Progress. Now the tune that we mostly know for this is called Monk's Gate, and it's named that because that was the village in Sussex where the tune was discovered by Ralph Vaughan Williams. And it's interesting that the tune was set to, should we say, quite an earthy song. Let me read you the words of the song. It was actually called Our Captain Calls All Hands, sung by a local lady called Harriet Verrall. I got this information from an article in the Telegraph again. There's nothing devotional about Our Captain Calls, a song of a woman deserted by her sailor lover. How can you go abroad fighting for strangers? Why don't you stay at home, free from all dangers, she asks. I will roll you in my arms, my own dearest jewel. So stay at home with me, love, and don't be cruel. And then 3 years later, Vaughan Williams had the same tune being used for a different song, but a very similar theme. It was a folk song called The Blacksmith Courted Me. Don't you remember when you lay beside me, and you said you'd marry me and not deny me? Actually, I should sing it really. Don't you remember when you lay beside me, and you said you'd marry me and not deny me? Well, it's a very heavenly vision, but as I say, a very earthy tune. The words of the two songs from which this tune was collected lead us naturally to think about folk music as a means of telling a story, a form of storytelling, which brings us round again to parables as a form of storytelling. And in fact, many of these folk songs, you could kind of read them as parables, or at the very least as cautionary tales or morality tales. They very often involve people who, in one way or another, step out of line or invoke somebody's displeasure or act without thinking in a thoughtless way and suffer the consequences. The stories often have a supernatural element as well, that vengeance can reach back even from beyond the grave, as we'll see in one of the examples in a moment. So what makes these songs such great containers for folk wisdom? Well, they're very gripping stories. They're very well told. They have a lot of tension in them. They're very simple metre, so that they're easy to sing. Often the last line is emphasised, it's sung twice, so that you really keep getting the message hammered home. So I've picked 3 examples which I want to sing to you, extracts of them, and tell you the stories behind them. And they illustrate some of the aspects of storytelling through folk music. The first one is one called Sauvé, or sometimes called Sophie. It's round in many versions and found in many places, and the one I'm particularly thinking of was recorded by Pentangle in the 1960s. And the story is this. Sauvé is a woman who's engaged to a man, and she's sitting at home and the man is on his way to see her in his carriage, and she devises a plan to see whether he's actually a true and faithful lover. So she dresses herself as a man, as a highwayman, and rides out with her guns, and she intercepts the carriage and holds it up, pulls him out of the carriage and says, hand over all your gold and all your jewels and all the riches that you carry and all the things I guess he was bringing to give to her as wedding gifts, which he does. She then says, there's one more thing, that ring on your hand. If you hand that over, I'll spare your life. He says no. He said, this is a token from my sweetheart. and I'd rather die than give it up. You shoot me and you'll hang for killing me, but I will never give this up. So the story shifts on, and he arrives at the house where she's waiting to greet him, dressed normally. And as he walks in, he sees laid out all his gold and his riches, and he's extremely abashed. The song says he has rosy, blushing face like a maid. And then she explains to him what her plan was, and it culminates in this last verse, which has got a real sting in the tail. I only did it for to know if you would be a man or no. If you'd given me that ring, she said, I'd have pulled the trigger and shot you dead. Yes, moving on rapidly. Jealousy in another form, song of the cruel sister. Two sisters, one blonde and fair, one dark and pale, both in love with the same man, and of course he goes for the blonde and fair one. That always seems to be the way in these stories. So the dark sister invites her blonde sister to go walking with her by the side of the sea. They arrive at the cliffs and she basically pushes her in, and the song talks about how she's floating on the waves like a swan, crying out, you know, be great, be merciful to me, help me, get me out, you know, don't reject me. But the dark sister just hardens her heart and leaves her to drown. The body is found by some troubadours, and this is the gruesome bit. They make a harp out of her breastbone with strings made from her golden hair. And as it happens in these stories, their next engagement is to play at the wedding of the dark-haired sister. And as they get the harp out, the harp actually begins to play itself. And this is what the song says. The first string sang a doleful sound, lay the bent to the bonny broom, the bride her younger sister drowned, fa la 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 la. The second string, as that they tried, lay the bent to the bonny broom, in terror sits the black-haired bride, fa la 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 la. The third string sang beneath their bow, lay the bent to the bonny broom, and surely now her tears will flow, fa la 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 la. Vengeance from beyond the grave. Just one more, Matty Groves. I've called this the dangers of adultery, and actually it's more the dangers of annoying powerful people. Matty Groves, a fair young local lad, is attending church on a festival morning, and there he is seen by the daughter of Lord Donald, the local lord of the manor, Well, it's true I have 2 beaten swords, and they cost me deep in the purse, but you will have the better of them, and I will have the worse. I will have the worse, and you will strike the very first blow, and strike it like a man. And I will strike the very next blow, and I'll kill you if I can. I'll kill you if I can. So Matty struck the very first blow, and he hurt Lord Donald sore. Lord Donald struck the very next blow, and Matty struck no more. Matty struck no more. And then Lord Donald took his wife, and he sat her on his knee, saying, who do you like the best of us, Matty Groves or me? Matty Groves or me? And then up spoke his own dear wife, never heard to speak so free. I'd rather a kiss from dead Matty's lips than you or your finery. You or your finery. So the English folk song tradition is full of lots of very memorable ballads, stories, cautionary tales, parables. Why not turn that on its head? Would some of the parables of Jesus be fixed in people's memory and brought home to them in a different way if they were in this kind of form? I suppose this was the idea in my mind when my mentor in training for the preaching course was taking me along to a church and mentioned the week before she'd like me to read and give a short reflection on the story of the unjust judge and the widow. It seemed such a natural story to turn into a folk song. It had all the sorts of ingredients that so many traditional folk songs have. So I turned it into a folk song and sang it at the church, and yeah, it was good fun. Of course, as we set about doing this, you don't just immediately leap from here's the story, let's turn it into a folk song. It needs a little bit more thought than that. It needs, I suppose, to be technical, the exegesis of the passage and the exposition of the passage and working out what it's saying to us today, what the key point is. And I've written all that up in the accompanying notes. It would be quite turgid to just sit here and read it out. So let's just jump straight to the result, which is the story of the unjust judge and the persistent widow. Hope you enjoy it. There was a judge in a certain city who feared neither man nor God, had no care for truth or for justice, just to make all the money he could, lived to make all the money he could. And in that town there lived a poor widow who had been cheated of all she possessed. Before the power of men she was helpless, left with nothing but fear and distress. Nothing but fear and distress. She brought her case to the judge in her anguish. I have been treated most cruelly. You are the only one to stand for me. Save me from my adversary. Save me from my adversary. But the judge showed her no compassion, only looked at her scornfully. There's nothing that she can do for me. I'll pay no heed to a miserable plea. Pay no heed to a miserable plea. Still she brought her complaint before him, and she begged him again and again. He closed his ears to her cries for justice, gave her naught but the utmost disdain, naught but the utmost disdain. From the court to his house she pursued him, behold her knocking upon his door. Will none give me rest from this woman? Oh, I swear I can stand it no more. I swear I can stand it no more. Every day she appeared in his presence, until she robbed him of all of his peace. I'll grant all that she asks of me swiftly, only then will she ever cease, only then will she ever cease. Is this your God, unbelieving Christian, whose ears are closed to your fervent prayer? Are you knocking and seeking and asking, or do you think that your God doesn't care? Do you think that your God doesn't care? Or does he love the least of his children? And is he swift to come to their aid? Do you wrestle with him for an answer? Do you trust, though so long you have prayed? Do you trust, though so long you have prayed? Your prayer is heard by a loving Father. He knows your needs before you speak. In his grace he will give you what's better, though it be not the thing that you seek, though it be not the answer you seek. There was a judge in a certain city, but it is God who sits on the throne. Will he not answer with justice and mercy? Will he not hear the cries of his own? Will he not hear the cries of his own? So that's my version of The Unjust Judge and the Widow. We spend so much time in the church thinking about how to communicate with different generations, and I suppose particularly with younger generations, so used to visual media, so used to short, snatchy things, and we use videos, we use PowerPoint, we use drama, we use illustrations of various sorts, enactments, rituals. Maybe there's a place for the return of the troubadours and the bards who can take Bible truths and sing them in a memorable way that will electrify their audiences and engross them in the stories and help them to go away with some real learning.